Thomas Richardson was a brilliant scientist who had dedicated his life to the study of genetics. He had always been fascinated by the idea of cloning, and he had spent years perfecting his technique. However, he never imagined that his work would one day lead him down a dark and dangerous path. It all started with a tragedy. Dr. Richardson's wife and children were killed in a horrific airplane crash, leaving him devastated and alone. He couldn't bear the thought of living without them, so he turned to his research for solace. Using the DNA samples he had collected from his family before their untimely death, Dr. Richardson began to clone them in his laboratory. He spent months painstakingly recreating every detail, from their physical appearance to their personality traits. At first, Dr. Richardson was overjoyed. He felt like he had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. But as time passed, he began to notice something strange about his clones. They were not the same as the family he had lost. They were colder, more distant, and lacked the spark of life that had made his wife and children so special. Dr. Richardson tried to ignore these differences, telling himself that they were just quirks of the cloning process. But as his clones continued to grow and develop, he realized that he had made a grave mistake. By playing God, he had created something that was not meant to exist. The clones began to exhibit strange behaviors, acting out in ways that his family never would have. They were quick to anger, and they seemed to have no regard for the sanctity of life. Dr. Richardson was terrified, realizing that he had created something that he could no longer control. As the clones grew more and more erratic, Dr. Richardson realized that he had to put an end to his experiment. But it was too late. The clones had already gained a will of their own, and they were determined to keep their new life at any cost. Dr. Richardson was forced to watch as his family clones turned on him, seeking revenge for their unnatural existence. They had become monsters, devoid of the compassion and empathy that had once made them human. In the end, Dr. Richardson was consumed by the very thing he had created. He had played God, and he had paid the ultimate price for his arrogance. The clones he had created had become his own personal hell, and there was no escape from the horror that he had unleashed. As Dr. Richardson took his last breath, he realized that he had made a grave mistake. He had tried to cheat death, but instead, he had brought it back to life in a form that was more terrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. It was a dark and stormy night when David settled into his favorite armchair with a new novel he'd just picked up from the bookstore. He was always a fan of horror stories, and this one was no exception. The book's title, Echoes of the Past, piqued his interest, and he couldn't wait to dive in. As he read through the first chapter, David noticed something odd. The protagonist's name was David, and the setting of the story was eerily similar to his own life. The house described in the book was identical to his own, and the street name mentioned in the book was also the same as his. At first, David dismissed it as a coincidence, but as he delved deeper into the book, he realized that the similarities were far too many to be coincidental. The characters in the book were all based on people he knew, and the events that took place in the story were all too familiar. The protagonist, David, just like him, was a successful businessman who lived alone in a big house in a quiet neighborhood. But as the story progressed, David started to feel uneasy. The book was a horror story, and it seemed to be hinting that something terrible was about to happen. As the protagonist in the book started to experience strange occurrences, David also started to notice things that seemed out of place in his own life. The shadows in his home seemed to move on their own, and he heard strange noises that he couldn't explain. The more he read, the more convinced David became that the book was warning him of impending danger. The book had a dark and ominous feel to it, and it seemed to be leading up to a gruesome ending. David tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was starting to consume him, but he couldn't help but feel that he was being watched. He felt like someone or something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the story in the book reached its climax, David could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that the killer in the story was about to strike, and he feared that he might be the next victim. And then, just as he had feared, a masked figure burst into his home, brandishing a knife. David tried to run, but he was too slow, and the killer caught up to him. As the blade sliced through his flesh, David realized that the horror story he had been reading had become his own reality. In the end, David became just another victim in the book, and his story would forever be a part of echoes of the past. The killer had claimed yet another victim, and his reign of terror continued unabated. The new residents of an old neighborhood were excited to be invited to their first Halloween party by their friendly neighbors. They arrived at the party and were warmly welcomed by the community, who were all dressed up in spooky costumes. As the night went on, the new residents began to notice that something was off about their neighbors. They seemed to have an otherworldly quality to them, and their eyes glinted strangely in the dim light. The party continued, and the neighbors offered them delicious drinks and snacks, which they eagerly accepted. Suddenly, one of the new residents noticed that the drinks had a strange red tint to them, and they began to feel lightheaded and dizzy. They stumbled outside for some fresh air and noticed that the full moon was out, and they started to feel a strange urge to hunt. It was then that they realized that their friendly neighbors were not just humans in costumes, but vampires who had been preying on the new residents all along. They tried to run, but the neighbors were too quick for them. They were captured and taken into the basement of one of the houses, where they saw the neighbors feasting on the blood of their other victims. The new residents soon realized that they had stumbled into a trap, and that their neighbors were actually a group of vampires who had been living in the neighborhood for centuries. The neighbors had lured them in under the guise of a Halloween party, and now they were trapped and at their mercy. As the night went on, the new residents found themselves slowly turning into vampires themselves, and they were horrified at the thought of becoming like their monstrous neighbors. They knew that they had to escape before it was too late, but it was a race against time, as the sun would soon rise, and they would be trapped forever. Your own words. It was a beautiful day in the woods when 9-year-old Lily went missing. Her parents searched the area frantically, but she was nowhere to be found. As the sun began to set, they discovered a creepy old doll on the ground, surrounded by leaves and twigs. They recognized the doll as one they had given Lily for her birthday, but it was in terrible condition. Its hair was matted, its clothes were torn, and its once cheerful face was now twisted into a menacing scowl. As they picked up the doll, they heard a faint whisper. It was Lily's voice. They were filled with hope as they realized that their daughter might still be alive. They took the doll home and tried to clean it up, but strange things started happening. They would find the doll in different places around the house, as if it were moving on its own. They would hear Lily's voice whispering in the night, even when the doll was in a different room. As time went on, they began to suspect that the doll was more than just a toy. They started to notice that it had a strange, supernatural energy about it. They felt as if it were watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. One night, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from Lily's bedroom. They ran in, and to their horror, the doll was now a life-sized version of their daughter. She had the same twisted scowl as the doll, and her eyes were dark and empty. They soon realized that the doll had taken on a life of its own and had stolen their daughter's soul. They were trapped